Going live. Live.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Nutrition and the Brain talk for nutrition professionals by myself, Tara Swart, and the wonderful Sophie Medlin, our resident dietitian. So I will introduce myself quickly first. I am the Chief Science Officer here at Heights. I am a medical doctor by background and have a PhD in neuroscience. And I've been involved from the start in the formulation, and I have regular chats with Sophie about updating things to, keep tweaking the Heights capsules to be exactly what we feel that people need. So it's very responsive. And basically, Sophie works in a practice that's very similar to most of you. I work with executives, particularly stressed executives, but who are fit and healthy and are looking for brain optimization. So we're really going to present to you the whole spectrum of how what you do can help all sorts of different people. And I'll just let Sophie introduce herself.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming to another one of these sessions. I'm really excited to be here again, and Tara is an incredible wealth of knowledge in this area, as you can imagine, and has got so much great stuff to share this evening. So I'm the head of nutrition research at Heights, which is a job I've been doing for a while now. I feel very privileged and lucky to work with this amazing team and to be part of the product development journey. I've been a dietitian for a long time, since 2007. And I worked my way up through the NHS, as most dietitians do, and then I was an academic, so I was a lecturer and researcher for 5 years before I decided to step out and run my business, City Dietitians, and become a consultant dietitian. I still see lots of patients in my practice every week, so I am very much sort of got my finger on the pulse of what people are eating and what they're not eating and what's going on in the general population, as well as being a specialist in gut health and colorectal surgery. So this evening, if we want to move on, perfect. So what we're having to do is, much like the government when they're doing their special talks, we're having to ask Adam to kindly change the slide. So if you do hear us saying next slide, please, it's just try to imagine that we're as professional as the government, and that's what we're doing. While we're here, we would love to invite some of you to our Heights Ambassador Programme. If you want more information about this, we will share some more information at the end. The Heights Ambassador Programme, we're looking for individuals who care about brain health, who are invested in brain health, and who are interested from across the spectrum of all the strands of brain care that we care about as a company, to help us to share the messages, and we will in turn shout people out on social media and promote their businesses as well. So if you are interested in that, there will be more information in the chat box on YouTube, I think. So you can click on that and find out more, and we'll maybe tell you a little bit more about that at the end as well. So let's think about what is going on in the body and the things that our patients, the people who we work with, and perhaps ourselves and the general population might be experiencing day to day, that might suggest perhaps that our brain health is not quite as good as it could be. Some of the things that you will hear from patients or relatives or whoever else is discussing these kinds of things is perhaps a lack of focus. Maybe that kind of roller coaster of energy through the day, energy crashes in the day, really struggling with maintaining energy throughout the day. We're obviously in a mental health crisis in the country and in the world right now. So there are lots and lots of people who have diagnosed mental health conditions, but we also know across the board there are people struggling with low mood and increased anxiety, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the lifestyles that we lead. Perhaps the way that the pandemic has led us to change our lifestyles and adapt may now be having this sort of quite profound impact on lots of people's moods and anxiety levels and things like that. You will inevitably hear people talking about poor sleep and insomnia, whether that's struggling to get to sleep or waking up in the night. And lots of people will talk about brain fog and complain of brain fog. And it's, as lots of you will be aware, that's not a sort of medical term that we use. It's not something we've specifically studied, but it's certainly something that is reported heavily amongst patients and people in the general population. So it's something we're very interested in. And it's my belief, and I know it's Tara's belief as well, that it's very lifestyle and nutrition focused, as a causation as nutrition and lifestyle focus. So we're going to talk a bit about that too today. So this is the reason we're here. We want to help you to provide solutions to your patients, to your clients, to other people who you're working with, and perhaps to people around you, about how you can better improve your mental performance. These are the sorts of things you might be hearing and understanding that people might be struggling. So I'm going to hand over to Tara, who's going to do what I like to call the science bit, and then I'm going to do the food and nutrition bit afterwards.
Thanks, Sophie. So yeah, basically everything that Sophie just said. and the fact that we understand that people will present to you in many different ways. And what we're trying to put forward to you is a way of thinking that's perhaps a little bit different to how any of us in healthcare professionals have thought before, is to consider that the brain is the CEO of the body. And that if you can help people to take ownership of optimizing their brain, doing all of the physical things that put their brain in the best possible condition, then that obviously has a knock-on effect on mental health and the performance that you want, let's say, at work, but also that it will have a cascade effect on things like your skin, your hair, your nails, your gut health. So I guess what we're trying to say is that if somebody presents with something perhaps quite non-specific, or even something that doesn't necessarily seem to be related to brain health, it's still a really good idea to step back and think, okay, what can I advise this person about brain health that's going to give them overall better health? Thanks, Adam. So I am going to go through quite an exhaustive list of nutrients that your brain needs and what for. I'd really prefer you to just absorb it all, see what resonates. We're going to make it available to you in some kind of written form, so please don't feel that you have to write everything down. So the first thing is that the brain, although I've said it's the CEO of the body, it's tiny. It's a tiny percentage of your body weight, about 2 to 3%. It weighs like maybe a few kilos, but it can use up to 30% of the breakdown products of your diet. And in fact, whilst you're asleep, your brain is using up 20% of what you've eaten that day. When you're working, when you're switched on, task focused, interacting with somebody, it's using up about 25% of what you eat. And if you're stressed, which, I can't really back up Sophie enough in terms of what we've all been through in the last 15 months and the impact that that's had on our brains and our bodies. So I would suggest that currently more people than ever are perhaps their very metabolically hungry brain is using up more, like closer to 30% of what we eat. So given that it's such a big proportion of what we eat, I feel that people make food choices for all sorts of reasons. And we as professionals give advice for all sorts of different reasons. It could be, people might just eat something because it's delicious. You might be advising somebody because they want to lose weight, or they want to build muscle, or they have a particular sporting achievement that they're working towards. And what I always advocate is a brain first approach to eating. So rather than focusing on any one of those things, thinking about the fact that if your brain is well fed, if your brain is then operating in peak condition, and that's having a beneficial effect on your other organs and systems, that they're more likely to achieve the goals that they may have presented to you with. So I'm going to go through some vitamins, the essential fatty acids, some trace minerals that we don't always talk about, and a range of antioxidants, including anthocyanins, which are mostly found in darker skinned foods, and flavonoids. Okay, so I'm literally starting in alphabetical order. Hold on a sec, just need to switch things around a little bit. Okay. Vitamin A is important in brain development, and particularly about modulating neurogenesis. Now, neurogenesis doesn't happen an awful lot in the adult brain, but it does happen in the hippocampus, which is where we lay down new memories and embed new learning. And so that makes sense, because neurogenesis means growth of new neurons. And if you see children in your practice, or you've had a young child, then from 0 to 2 that these children go from being completely helpless to walking, talking, managing their own bowels and bladder, and telling you what they want to eat and what they don't want to eat. So there's a huge amount of brain growth in that first 2 years of life. There's a huge amount of pruning and super sophistication in the teenage years. And although neurogenesis, so this growth of embryonic neurons into fully formed neurons, doesn't happen as much after the age of 25, where we're talking about memory and learning, it absolutely is happening. So we do need to make sure that we're getting just the right amount of vitamin A. The B vitamins, I think, you know, you'll all be very familiar with the fact that if somebody presents with fatigue, energy issues, low mood that's not depression, then, you know, that's quite a good one to look into investigating blood tests and potentially supplementing. B complex, along with some other things that I'll come to, are important in reducing levels of homocysteine, which can be indicative of getting dementia later in life. And I know that there's a lot of interest in this area. So we've actually added in some slides to make sure that we've addressed your questions. Vitamin C, obviously a sort of universal antioxidant. It contributes to cognitive function. It's part of creating some of the neurotransmitters, which I'll go through one by one. It's anti-inflammatory. D has, you know, sort of gained a lot of importance in the last year and a half because we were locked up indoors. We had a great summer last year, but not so much this year. And I know that Sophie is going to talk a lot about how much we need to supplement and, you know, at what times of year, because I think there are a few sort of neuro myths about that floating around. But basically vitamin D is anti-inflammatory, it's neuroprotective, it actually reduces some of the pathologies that we see in the brain associated with dementing diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, so amyloid plaques. It supports the development of the brain, so it's important at every age. And if you are deficient in vitamin D, then you are more susceptible to COVID and other infections. It might even be contributing to the sort of brain fog symptoms that Sophie mentioned. And its deficiency is associated with being more prone to certain cancers and diseases of the nervous system, like multiple sclerosis, for example. And then vitamin E, so that, you know, the ACE kind of go together in terms of being antioxidant, protecting the DNA, protein and lipids. So basically all of your cells from oxidative damage that happens as the natural wear and tear of life, and particularly accelerated by stress, processed food, alcohol, antibiotics, things like that. Okay, so in terms of the fatty acids, basically these are absolutely critical to the brain. The brain is, the solid part of the brain is largely made up of fat. So there's DHA and there's EPA. You will have heard of both of them. We initially really focused on DHA because it's particularly important for the brain and eyes. It's found in the grey matter, particularly in the frontal lobes, which are regulating all of our emotions and you know, really controlling. If I said this brain is the CEO of the body, then the frontal lobes are the CEO of the brain, involved in memory, emotion, attention, everything. Also development of the brain and also neuroprotective. But we did move towards having a better balance of DHA and EPA because you really need the EPA to allow the DHA to sort of do its job properly. So it's anti-inflammatory, which, you know, is sort of a more general understanding of omega-3 particularly, may be implicated in reducing depression. But like I said, that combination is really important in terms of what we're focusing on particularly, which is the mental health and the brain performance. And then the trace minerals. So some of these I feel like we're all much more familiar with and some not as much. Iron, you know, we understand that we need iron for our hemoglobin to transport oxygen around the brain and the body, but it is also part of synthesizing certain neurotransmitters. Zinc, I'll come to this later. The evidence around this is a little bit equivocal, but, you know, it's a trace mineral that we do need for lots of things, including building embryonic cells into fully grown neurons, movement of those cells, and them differentiating into, you know, specific activities, pathways, and transmitters. Selenium, antioxidant, so sort of like the vitamins A, C, and E. Chromium, I mean, not one that I tend to talk about a lot, but glucose metabolism is really important in the body because of risk factors like diabetes and heart disease. and just the spiking of the sugar levels in terms of brain performance and being pro-inflammatory as well. Iodine, we were just sort of, Sophie giggled when I said this, but I said I would really only talk to someone about iodine, obviously if they had a thyroid function issue, but also because of this trend to move towards using Himalayan salt rather than sea salt. Sea salt is a great source of iodine, and we do need the right amount, enough but not too much iodine in our systems. If that is disrupted by thyroid disease or leads to some sort of thyroid hormone irregularity, then that can have an impact on your cognitive function. Magnesium is my favorite mineral. It's one of the very few things that I take on top of taking heights, which obviously, being very involved in deciding what's in it means that it's kind of everything that I want to take. But I do take magnesium. It underlies so many important processes in the brain and body: mood, sleep, just how the cells communicate with each other, and it is massively leached out of our systems by stress. So even prior to the pandemic, there was a statistic that about 70% of adults in the modern world are deficient in magnesium. If you ever get that twitchy eyelid, then that's quite a good sign that you're deficient in magnesium. It helps with memory, learning. It also contributes to regulating your blood sugar. So, all the things that I said about chromium. And magnesium is obviously important to lots of things like producing hormones and neurotransmitters as well, but you do need the right balance of zinc and magnesium. So perhaps it's important for that reason. And it's best taken transdermally. So we would not put that into the Heights capsule anyway, and it's also a very large molecule. So it's best taken with a gel or lotion or a bath soak to really replenish those magnesium levels that are leached by stress. And you simply cannot eat enough leafy greens or nuts and seeds to replenish magnesium if you're seriously stressed. Copper, we tend to look at this in quite rare disorders like Wilson's disease, which is a neurological disorder. And so it does seem to have a particular relevance to brain function and development. It's important for particular brain-specific enzymes that control neurotransmitters like dopamine, which is for reward, and also other neuropeptides. And then potassium is important for cell-to-cell signaling. It helps the body regulate fluid, muscle contractions, and it's really, really key for cell signaling within the nervous system. Okay, so like I said, that's a lot of information. So I really want you to think, does this spark a question for you that we could answer later? Now, blueberries, another one of my favorite things. In fact, I'm obsessed with eating dark foods because basically there's the anthocyanins are a group of flavonoids with high antioxidant activity. And that blueberries are an excellent source of them. And although I love blueberries, you literally have to eat about 25 blueberries a day to get the maximum benefits. And that's why having that in the capsule was just such a great way to make sure that you're getting that. And of course, eat blueberries as well. So there's a lot of cardiovascular implications of eating blueberries in terms of all heart disease risk factors, particularly reducing LDL, reducing DNA damage, helping with brain function, memory and learning, and being neuroprotective. So although I love blueberries, eating black beans, aubergine, purple sprouting broccoli, cherries or strawberries are, kind of all contribute to that neuroprotection against toxins, inflammation, and any cellular injury or leakage that might be affecting your brain performance. So now on to the neurotransmitters, and you've probably heard this before, but I think that using this acronym DOSE is just a really quick and easy way to remember what we're mostly focused on in terms of the brain being really optimized. So that's dopamine for reward, and motivation and movement, oxytocin for a sense of belonging and bonding and a good sense of personal and work identity, serotonin that regulates mood, and endorphins, which are basically the sort of the feel-good factors, the painkillers. So dopamine is, like I said, associated with reward or pleasure, but it's also part of the learning, memory, movement systems, and more. So depending on which pathway dopamine's in, then an overactivity or an underactivity can have very, very different effects. For instance, my PhD was on Parkinson's disease, and that's about underactivity of dopamine in the nigrostriatal pathway. But my previous career was as a psychiatrist, where schizophrenia, for example, is about overactivity of dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway. Oxytocin, it's the love hormone. It's part of the process of childbirth, of breastfeeding, of bonding between a newborn baby and parents, but it's also part of friendship, falling in love, social bonding, and work bonding. So serotonin it's the mood hormone, but serotonin receptor sensitivity is actually what we need to be looking at in terms of mental health and brain performance, not necessarily serotonin levels. So what we see in depression is that the receptors become less sensitive. That can be improved by SSRIs, which we're going to talk a little bit about later, but it can equally be improved by psychological therapy. And there are some, nutritional impacts on that too. So it's not just about mood, it's also about thinking or cognition, learning, memory, reward, lots of physical processes. There's a lot of serotonin produced in the gut, which Sophie might mention later. And then endorphins obviously are to do with pleasure, but I think a really important factor that might be coming up in your clinical practice is that endorphins relieve physical pain. When people are in psychological pain, they require the beneficial impact of endorphins, but they don't get them. So there are some foods that can contribute to that, and obviously exercise is a massive contributor to boosting endorphins in the brain-body system. So which of the nutrients that we could take or recommend contribute to which neurotransmitters specifically? I've got the list here. There's not too much more to say than what's on this list, but basically, if you ascertain that somebody is struggling with mood rather than motivation, then you could think more about iron, some of the B vitamins and vitamin D. I mean, obviously there's a lot of overlap here, but it's in terms of targeting, it can help you to think a bit more about what might be really beneficial for this person. Obviously, blood testing helps with that as well. Vitamin C is really important and implicated in production of all neurotransmitters, more than the ones even that I've written here. Vitamin D, we know, is very important, particularly if you have patients with seasonal affective disorder whose mood significantly drops in the winter months, whose metabolism drops, so they require more sleep, more food. Vitamin D supplementation can have a really significant impact on mood in those sorts of areas. All of the B complex, so vital to the nervous system and indeed all of the neurotransmitters. And iron, particularly for dopamine, noradrenaline, adrenaline, and 5-HTP, which is a precursor of serotonin. So I wasn't surprised to see quite a lot of questions about homocysteine, because even in the area that I work, which is more about optimization than disease now, there's a lot of this. If people are stressed or they've got brain fog for whatever reason, and Sophie will go into that more, and they're just a little bit more forgetful than before, the first conclusion that people jump to is that they're getting Alzheimer's. And I'm seeing this in people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And, we always say in medicine that the most likely explanation is most likely the correct one. And for somebody in their 30s or 40s, to be saying that they think their memory disruption is Alzheimer's is not a healthy conclusion to jump to. You can do blood testing for homocysteine levels, which are a strong indicator of potential to develop dementia later in life. Personally, I think that that comes with a very depressing knowledge that it might be inevitable, and that really we should all be doing the things that we can be to try to keep those levels down. And so I would rather focus on helping people to be doing those things anyway, which will help their memory now and be protective for the future. And particularly if they're deficient in folate, vitamin B6, B12, and a couple of the other things that I'll come to on the next slide, then it's really beneficial to just help them with their diet or to supplement those things specifically, not because they might actually be developing Alzheimer's now, but obviously if they are, sure. But if that's less likely, it's still really important to look at these factors. So I mentioned the B vitamins that contribute to reducing homocysteine levels, and the evidence around zinc is equivocal. It's there. There are also studies that say that it made no difference. So like I said, when I talked about zinc earlier, of course, it contributes to amplifying the impacts of magnesium, of balancing the other minerals in the body, and has some impacts of its own. So people should not be deficient in it, but I don't think there's enough evidence that it directly, can contribute to reducing homocysteine levels. But the combination of the B vitamins with omega-3, there's a lot of evidence for this. A lot of the papers are on our website, but we can also provide you with the ones that we've used to inform our talk today. And there's also evidence that the combination of B vitamins, omega-3, and potent antioxidants is really the sort of trifecta of what we could be doing to protect our brains for future. So interestingly, the research is, there's quite a variety of what's out there. So what I wanted to do was both share this list with you, but also show you a nice little infographic, if we could call it that, that perhaps shows slightly different things. So obviously the B vitamins are all on here. And really in this pathway, it's about trying to reduce homocysteine levels in the blood by converting it to methionine mostly, or potentially cysteine. And so we see that vitamin B6 is helpful in changing homocysteine to cysteine, that folate and B12 convert homocysteine to methionine, and so does choline actually, but through the betaine pathway, which is a slightly different pathway. So basically wanted to present you with all of that, and then really take that knowledge and the idea of eating in a brain first way. And something else that I want to say that I think is really important that we should be educating people about is it's not just what you eat or what supplements you take. It's about mindful eating as well. So we often say that, what you imbibe is not just what you eat and drink. It's the news that you watch. It's the people that you hang around with. But also when you sit down to eat, you can choose to eat in a mindful way that actually reduces your cortisol levels, the stress hormone, that brings you into the present, makes you very aware of what you're eating, where it's come from, the quality of the food, the taste, the texture, everything. And for me in lockdown, that's been a way of increasing my mindfulness minutes without necessarily having to sit down and meditate. So I do think that how we eat is really important in terms of optimizing brain performance and looking after our mental health, if we can take that opportunity to bring a bit of mindfulness in. And I'm going to address this later from one of the questions that we have coming up, but I just want to, as I hand over to Sophie, to say that ideally we would all just eat really healthily. And personally, I eat really healthily, all organic if I can. I grow my own vegetables, cook, don't eat any processed food. But due to agricultural practices and non-seasonal eating, it's still really hard to get the best of everything that you need nutritionally just from a super good diet. And of course, if we're traveling or we're stressed or something's going on at work or in our family, even that can fall off the wagon a little bit. So personally, I take Heights. I've got the annual subscription, and I feel that that tops up anything that I might not be getting from a perfectly organic, seasonal, local, home cooked diet. So with that, both the nutritional piece and the mindfulness piece, I'm really happy to hand over to Sophie, who is just going to give more practical guidance on what you can do for yourself and your patients.
Thanks, Tara. You are such a fantastic presenter. It's always intimidating following someone who is so talented. Have you lost me, or can you still hear me at least?
I can hear you, but not see you.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. It was absolutely fine all the way through until this very moment. So I think if I keep really still, I might get away with it. Let me try and put my camera back on. Sorry, everyone. If you've ever heard me speak before, I always seem to have these technical problems. So what I wanted to talk to you all about is a practical way of putting these things that Tara's talked to us about into practice. And I'm hoping that my camera is going to catch up to speed any second now and we'll be back to normal. So let's think about what you need to get from your brain. What does your brain need from food? And one of the ways that we can think about being able to incorporate this into our practice and supporting our patients to be able to do this is to focus on what is called the mind diet, unfortunately, but we would prefer it to be called something like the mind way of eating. And this is a highly researched and well presented way of eating, which is an amalgamation of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. And the acronym MIND stands for Mediterranean Dash Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. So this is a diet that's been pulled together from two different really excellent dietary programs. So the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, which is mainly focused on reducing hypertension, into this way of eating that is really, really brain focused, which is exciting and something that we can all be talking about to our clients. One of the things that Tara and I were discussing was the fact that actually whatever someone's motivation is for eating well, whether that is that they have family members with Alzheimer's and they're worried about their brain, or whether it's that they have family members with diabetes, for example, whatever someone's motivation is for eating well, we can really encourage them to do that using various different evidence-based methods. And so many people do struggle with this brain fog, lack of sleep, all these kinds of things that you can really then use to anchor the reason why you would recommend a diet like the MIND diet to them. And of course, it's an evidence-based way of eating and largely incorporates all the things you would absolutely expect it to. So on the next slide, we can see the foods that are incorporated and encouraged within the MIND diet. And again, it's very much the things that we associate with general healthy eating. So green leafy vegetables, really, really important for loads of important nutrients, so particularly those trace minerals that Tara was talking about. All other vegetables, so focusing on really eating a rainbow, really important again for making sure we're getting all of those antioxidants, and also the full range of polyphenols. Polyphenols are those super important plant compounds that we're really just learning about, that we're really just uncovering. Turns out there's more than 8,000 of them have already been uncovered, and we're still learning more and more every day about polyphenols. But the key to getting the full range of polyphenols is to really eat a rainbow. So encouraging our patients and clients to eat a full range of fruits and vegetables as diverse as they possibly can. Nuts and seeds are again really, really important and a really key part of the MIND diet, and you'll remember that they are also an important part of the Mediterranean diet and also the DASH diet, so nothing new there. Great source of fiber, great source again of those trace elements that are trickier to find elsewhere in the diet, and a good source of plant-based proteins. Again, berries, really, really focused here. So that's a difference from the MIND diet to the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet, which don't necessarily pull out berries. But of course, berries, particularly those blueberries and darker berries with their anthocyanin content, known to be really well associated with improving brain function and performance. Again, focusing on beans and legumes, again, there is lots of different anthocyanins, lots of different polyphenols in beans and legumes that we perhaps don't really realize, but when you actually look at a sort of plate of beans and legumes, the sort of mixed ones, there's a really great diversity of colour in there, and so that does mean that there are different anthocyanins, different antioxidants, and different ones that we do want to be focusing on. Again, great source of plant-based protein, and we all know that reducing our meat consumption is probably a good thing. We will talk about the impacts of cutting out meat consumption shortly. Beans and pulses is a good source of iron, a plant-based iron, and also a good source of B vitamins for people on a plant-based diet too, so worth focusing on those sorts of things. But all of us in an ideal world would try to reduce some of our, particularly our red meat consumption, and replace it with beans and pulses, because that can make a really big difference to our long-term health as well. We all know about whole grains and the importance of whole grains in terms of just focusing on those less processed grains as much as possible. And again, not only is that going to impact in terms of things like polyphenols and nutrients, so iron and that sort of thing, but we can also benefit from the fibre. And I'm going to talk a little bit about gut health shortly, because it's something I care very much about. The Mind diet, because of the omega-3 piece, also speaks heavily and focuses heavily on fish consumption, so something that we should be encouraging. And of course, there is a huge motivation at the moment to be conscious about fish consumption in terms of the environment. So I would be particularly pro, all nutrition pros, pushing their patients towards choosing environmentally focused fish sources, so sustainable fish sources where at all possible, in order to optimize their nutrition, but also protect our planet, as we all know is so important. On the Mind diet, poultry is encouraged, as well as olive oil and also red wine. So that's, again, a slight difference. I think olive oil, we all know, is encouraged on the Mediterranean diet and also on the DASH diet, but perhaps red wine less so. Can you just confirm that you can still hear me, Tara?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you. I think I should come back in on camera now as well, which will be good. I'm going to keep talking and hope that you can continue to hear me. So we do also encourage olive oil on the Mind diet, which is really important. And we also are focused on red wine. So red wine, you'll remember, is part of the Mediterranean diet. And the reason for that is the flavonols. So those really important particles, those important polyphenols that are part of red wine that do then have those cardioprotective effects. So important, I guess, to acknowledge, and for everyone watching, that we're not encouraging you to go out and start binge drinking red wine and get drunk every night on red wine, because that's certainly not going to do you any favours. And with alcohol, you can absolutely outdo the benefits quite easily by overdoing it. So it's really important to be conscious of dose of red wine, but ultimately including red wine in the diet does give you a really accessible way of including those polyphenols in your diet that can be more difficult to find elsewhere. So a moderate consumption of red wine can be useful for people in that situation. My computer is going crazy and it's very distracting. Apologies. I'm going to
Sophie, we can hear you
start the video
and see the slides. Don't worry at all.
That's really great to know. Thank you. I shall try it and keep going. My screen keeps going black as well. It's really funny because today I actually thought to myself, maybe I don't need to buy a new laptop after all, and now I need to order one immediately. Okay, so I'm going to keep going roughly by memory of what's going to come up. So the other thing that we as a company really think is very important to try and include in all healthy balanced diets is also fermented foods. So fermented foods, including things like kefir and kimchi, and other fermented foods that you might even make at home, so pickles and that sort of thing, are a really excellent thing to consider including in your diet for various different reasons. So one of the main reasons being supporting your microbiome. So our microbiome plays a really key role in regulating some of those neurotransmitters that Tara was talking about earlier. So not only regulating them in terms of them being in the right doses, but also upregulating them, making sure that we're getting enough of them into our brains so they're having the impacts that we want them to across the whole of the body. And a lot of those neurotransmitters also have an impact on our gut function as a whole. So they impact how quickly or slowly our gut moves and functions. And we know that the quicker and slower our gut moves, that has an impact on our microbiome as well. So it's a bi-directional relationship between neurotransmitters, brain health, and neurotransmitters and gut health. And it's really important that we do focus on that. So foods containing probiotics, so fermented foods in particular, is something to really think about. And we also have a very interesting conversation about dairy and the importance of dairy for brain health in general. And one of the things that is important to recognise is that while plant-based milks have become pretty much the norm, really, I think, and standard practice, when we do take dairy out of our diets, we are ultimately putting ourselves mainly at a disadvantage in terms of iodine. So that's the biggest risk, really, when we cut dairy out of our diet in this country, that people can become deficient in iodine. Iodine is really, really important for regulating our thyroid function. So that's an important part of it. And of course, if people's thyroid function is disrupted because they become deficient in iodine, for example, then that can then lead to things like mood disorders. As we know, it can lead to things like poorer mental performance because our thyroids might be underactive, and that can have a huge impact on our overall well-being. So dairy is something to think about and to be aware of, particularly if people are taking it out of their diet. So things to limit is on the next slide. So again, we're focusing on the Mind diet and the things that the Mind diet would recommend that people limit. And here, typically, and as you can imagine, we are thinking about things like red meat. So primarily in this context, the reason that we want people to be conscious of their red meat consumption is because of the impact that it can have on people's vascular systems. So the impact it can have on the way that our brains and our bodies can have enough blood flow around them, and how that is impacting various different things. So important to be conscious of red meat. As a colorectal specialist dietitian, I'm constantly talking and thinking about red meat because we know that the World Cancer Research Fund recommend just 2 portions of red meat a week, and certainly little or no processed meat is the best guidance that we have around processed meats and cancers in general. So just being really conscious of supporting your clients to make those healthy swaps. I had a lovely patient last week who was trying to be a bit healthier in terms of her snacks and had cut out on sweet things but had replaced them with salami. And of course, well, she's an Italian lady as well, so that makes it a little bit more difficult to have these conversations, but ultimately probably not the best direction for her as an individual. So just being conscious of those processed meats and the impact that they can have on our overall health. Butter consumption, again, because of that saturated fat picture. So encouraging patients and our clients and also the people who are around us just to be aware of butter consumption. And you'll remember that we are recommending here that people replace that with olive oil as their main fat source. Again, being conscious of free sugars. So no surprises here at all, and certainly nothing controversial. So free sugars within sugary snacks and things like that, for encouraging people to be conscious of those. And cheese in moderation is encouraged on the DASH diet, on the Mind diet, sorry. And again, that is because of the impact on saturated fats and how that can then impact long and short-term brain function and inflammation within the body. Of course, we're going to be encouraging people to limit fast food and fried food and those processed foods, delicious though they may be, and though we all want to eat them, we do need to be conscious of how they impact our long and short-term brain health. I think one of the things to be aware of when you are educating your patients on this kind of way of eating is that they may have some short-term benefits. They may notice a short-term benefit, but it really is like an insurance policy for your brain. And of course, so many people, particularly those who have seen relatives and loved ones suffer with dementia and other neurodegenerative conditions, really can be something that people are very focused on and a really great motivator for them to be eating as well as possible. So it's certainly by no means the only diet that you should be recommending or the only way of eating that you should be recommending, but where there is some really nice clear guidance and resources on it which you can steer your patients towards. And for those who are trying to optimize their brain health, those who are struggling with their mood, those who do have relatives who suffer with those neurodegenerative conditions, it may well be something that's a big motivator for them to be able to focus on and hang their healthy eating ideas and structure their diets around. I'm going to talk about missing food groups now. And of course, one of the big ones that we come across all the time now is people moving to a plant-based diet, so cutting out all animal products. Now, inherently, there is nothing particularly wrong with cutting out animal products from your diet, particularly if you're doing it because of environmental reasons or because of religious reasons or because of ethical reasons. And I think if anyone is making the decision to go on a completely vegan diet because of any of those reasons, then they're absolutely important to support everybody in that movement. What I would also say is that from a brain perspective and also from a general health perspective, there are consequences to cutting out food groups from our diet. There always are, regardless of whether that's just cutting out milk, just cutting out meat, or cutting out fish. So there are nutritional implications. So the most important nutrients that you'll get from fish if you take fish out of the diet is, of course, those omega-3s. And Tara's talked so eloquently about the impact of omega-3s and why we do need them so importantly for our brain function and performance. Important to remember that plant-based omega-3 sources, so ALA, which is the plant-based version of omega-3 essentially, needs to be converted into EPA and DHA, those active ones that Tara talked about earlier. And so whilst you can eat as many flax seeds as you can possibly get into your body and drink as much flax oil and whatever else you're going to do to try and get your vegan omega-3 in, ultimately very little of that is going to be converted into its active form, the one that we actually need in our body. And so for that reason, we recommend that people use an algae-based oil supplementation if they are on a plant-based diet and they've cut out fish, excuse me, to make sure they are getting that essential EPA and DHA that they need. Again, fish is also a great source of B vitamins, which we've talked about how vital they are for our brain function and performance. And same as if you cut out poultry. So the main thing you're going to be missing out on then is the B vitamins, particularly when you cut out meat from the diet. And that has a huge implication across the whole of the body. But when we're thinking about the brain in particular, it's about the inability to generate those neurotransmitters and to sustain those that brain health that we're looking for in terms of mental performance, but also long-term brain health in terms of keeping homocysteine levels down, all of those important things that Tara talked about. So B vitamins, omega-3s, and also things like choline, so those essential amino acids are more limited. Things like vitamin D is much more limited if we cut out animal products from the diet. And so ultimately, potentially, a lot of the things that we see in day-to-day, in our patients day-to-day, may be in part attributed to things that they might have cut out their diet. So we do need to be conscious of that and making sure that people are replacing those nutrients appropriately. There is a big narrative within the plant-based community and other communities that everything's completely fine and you don't need supplementation and you don't need to worry and you can meet all of your needs very easily. And whilst that is wonderful for most people or lots of people on a plant-based diet, for a lot of people it's going to be much, much more difficult to meet their nutrition needs, and they will see the consequences of that much, much earlier than perhaps other people do. The other group that we know about cutting out lots of things from their diet are the super low carb group, so the keto type crowd. And, you know, whilst low carbohydrate diets can, again, have some health benefits in terms of helping people to regulate their weight and all sorts of other things, there certainly isn't any evidence that it's going to be of significant benefit in terms of your long-term health, regardless of what you read online. And I, as a dietitian, have come against lots of different groups of polarized nutrition people in the past, and you know that there are certain communities within nutrition who are very evangelistic, let's say, in the way of eating, but none more so, I would say, than the keto low carb people are at the moment. And it's very difficult to say anything rational, anything scientific against ketogenic or low carb diets at the moment without getting a real onslaught of abuse from that community. So I'm going to say here that if you look objectively at what happens when you follow a very low carbohydrate diet, you're going to be cutting out almost all vegetables apart from green leafy vegetables because they all contain some starch or some carbohydrate. And that means that all of those polyphenols we've talked about before, not all of them, but a lot of them are going to be missed out on a very low carbohydrate diet. We're also going to be cutting out a significant amount of fiber from the diet, which then has that big impact on the microbiome, as we discussed. Nuts and seeds, so some nuts and seeds will probably be fine on a plant-based diet, super low carb diet, but certainly not all, which is a shame because that means that people are missing out on various different things. Berries may be included, but are often limited, which again means that we're missing out on those essential anthocyanins, and of course whole grains are going to be missed out on, more polyphenols left out of the diet, and generally alcohol won't be consumed, so wine won't be consumed. So you can see quite easily how even this pattern of eating, which ultimately is sort of opposite to the vegan pattern of eating, is going to lead to, or potentially lead to, less positive mental outcomes and brain health outcomes. And this is where we can sort of steer our patients to help them to understand why they might be experiencing those things. It's been well established, and I think we should all be very confident in ourselves in saying that when we take carbohydrates out of the diet and we replace them with those saturated fat products, so I'm thinking particularly about people snacking on cheese and bacon and sausages and thinking it's healthier than eating a piece of fruit. To me, there's a very obvious and logical reason that we would steer them away from that and into a more balanced way of eating. But I think to the general public, in the way that keto has been pushed over and people have been really consumed by that movement, I think we do need just to be conscious of how we deliver those messages. So we still know that the way of being the most healthy, the way that people enjoy the best health, is to eat the widest variety of grains within their diet. Oh, sorry, not just grains, but plants within their diet. And of course, any diet that limits that and encourages saturated fats and animal products, we know that that's going to have a less positive impact on health in the long run, even if the weight is reduced. So moving on then, I want to touch briefly on something that Tara mentioned before about deficiencies being far wider spread than we think. And I've mentioned to this group before, and perhaps you've heard me speaking on it, that we did some research of our client groups with patients, people who were interested in taking heights. We did some blood tests on them as a baseline to try and understand how common deficiencies, B vitamin deficiencies, were in particular within the general population. And again, you'll remember from the last talk, if you were there, that we recognise that we say a lot that there aren't common B vitamin deficiencies in the general population. And unfortunately, what we have learned from the trial work that we've done is that perhaps that's not quite the case. So the data that we were able to pull at baseline from our patients, or from the groups that we were looking at, was that 71% of people were deficient in thiamine. And again, you'll remember that thiamine is the B vitamin that's most associated with energy metabolism, and it's used up very rapidly when people do a lot of exercise. It's used up very rapidly when people are stressed. It's used up very rapidly when people drink alcohol, and also when people drink a lot of caffeine. And so it's really the absolute description of a pandemic that everyone's been experiencing. So there's a high number of people deficient in thiamine, which, as you'll remember from Tara's slides earlier, has a big impact on brain function and performance and the development or the production of neurotransmitters. We're 93% of people deficient in riboflavin, which is a huge number. And again, riboflavin, remembering its really important role in brain health and performance. So really sad to see that, but also something that I think is not well recognised, and something that's good to be able to pick up on so that we can spread the word of the importance. And these baseline tests were done at the end of October. And still at the end of the summer, sorry, beginning of October, so even at the end of the summer there, 71% of people at that point in the year deficient in vitamin D. On the next slide, you can see, so it's really confusing with these lab test results and it's driving the team mad. But on the next slide here, you can see this graph, which shows the number of people who were deficient. And what we've got here is, if it's above the line, they're deficient, and if it's below the line, they are replete. So above the line people, you can see most people being deficient. That's the thiamine stats there. And some of these people who were quite high in thiamine, interestingly for this group, most of them were taking things like Huel or meal replacement type drinks. So they were already having a lot of additional B1 in their diet from artificial sources rather than from food sources. And I can't say to you that's because food sources are completely depleting thiamine now or anything like that. But these are the facts. The people who weren't taking those kinds of meal replacement things were generally deficient. And those who were, those anomalies, they were generally using meal replacement drinks, which would have had additional thiamine added to them as part of the sort of production process. So you'll be pleased to know that we managed to correct lots of those deficiencies. So we had 80% of thiamine deficiencies corrected after, I think it was 8 months in the end, 85% of riboflavin deficiencies, and only 30% of vitamin D deficiencies corrected. When we designed heights, I said, we can't put more than double what the government recommends in these capsules for vitamin D, because I'm going to get in trouble and it's not the right thing to do. And so we had this real back and forth with Tara and the team saying, well, I would take more vitamin D than that. And me saying, well, we probably would, but ultimately what the government recommends, and we even went to 200% what the government recommends, we don't want to exceed that too much. There are consequences to having too much vitamin D. As you can see, after 8 months of taking more vitamin D, so double the vitamin D that we're recommended to take, so 20 micrograms, only 30% of people had their vitamin D deficiency corrected, which was a real surprise to me. We've upped the vitamin D in heights now by 2.25%. I will say that in people's clinical practice as well, it's the general, or I've colloquially heard, it's the general experience of people that actually, of dietitians and nutritionists, that level of vitamin D just isn't enough to get people through the winter. And we've known obviously it's not enough to correct deficiency, but it's interesting to see that it's perhaps not even enough to get people through the winter. So we do need to be thinking about that dose and what we recommend to people, particularly those in higher risk groups. So moving on, this is our correction. So it's just a graph showing the correction of thiamine deficiency, and you'll remember that below the red line is replete in thiamine, which we're really, really pleased to see. And again, some really interesting variation in results. So we can see this person here in the middle who was taking Huel before and then just meets and has stopped taking Huel, so it's stayed in the same range, and other people who've made some interesting dietary changes, which has made an impact for people. We had a couple of people who had long COVID, and those people had at some point, we'd struggled to correct their B vitamin deficiencies, and that we think that's because of the B vitamin deficiencies appear to be an important part of long COVID and the picture that people are experiencing. And I've seen that in my clinical practice, and it'll be interesting to pull some data on that if anyone else has got any other data showing vitamin deficiencies in long COVID. So in terms of putting this into your practice, I think it's important to think about what your 5 take-home messages might be. And for me, I think the first one to think about is keeping an eye out for those things that your patients are saying to you, or your people around you, people that you're working with are saying to you about their struggles. So if we think about asking them about their stress, asking them about their energy, asking them about mental performance, and asking them about sleep issues, I think as nutrition professionals, if we don't, we're doing our patients a disservice, because not only can they be signs, those struggling with these things can be signs of nutritional deficiencies, but also poor nutrition drives those problems for people. And if we miss them, then we're missing out on something we can support people with. And I think in particular, thinking about with stress and those sorts of things, how that does impact people's nutritional requirements and what we can do about that. The next thing for me is don't assume people aren't deficient in B vitamins. I think we are due a very big piece of work in this, and obviously you'll probably be aware that the DRVs are being looked into and we're working on that at the moment, but we do need to be thinking about, is the things that we have been accepted wisdom within nutrition, are they still correct today? And if not, what's going on there, and can we uncover things? And I think that's something we just need to all be aware of in our practice. What are those signs and symptoms of B vitamin deficiencies? And do our patients exhibit any of those in their day-to-day lives? And lastly, from me, I think using the mind diet as a framework for treatment, particularly for those who are thinking about their brain, who are interested in putting that first and are motivated in that direction, or anyone who is struggling with their mental health or performance, the mind diet can be an excellent framework for supporting people in their treatment and to adopt a healthier lifestyle. Over to you, Tara.
Thank you. Yeah, so of the top 5, Sophie got to pick 3 and I only got to pick 2. So I'm going to go back to 2 points that I think I made quite strongly. The first one being to consider your nutrition from a brain first perspective. It's been really revolutionary for me personally, and I started eating in a different way around the age of 30. I called it the reverse aging diet because, it's got a whole host of knock-on benefits. It's also protective for the gut and, and sort of good for your brain power. And then finally, like I said, another point number 5, Adam. Thank you. Which is that a few things. One is that, of course, we'd rather people just ate super healthy food, but because that's not always possible. I mean, it's not always possible from a financial point of view. It's not always possible from a time poverty point of view. It's not possible sometimes because there are people of different ages or with different medical conditions or different needs in a family. So if you can't eat in a completely healthy, cooked from scratch, grown by yourself or organic, seasonal, local way, then do consider supplementation as being brain boosting. So both, obviously, if there's a deficiency, that the person becomes replete, but also that if you're healthy, but you want to be better, then there are certain supplements. And from my point of view, pretty much the ingredients that are in Heights plus magnesium transdermally plus a probiotic that make a really significant difference to your resilience and your brain performance. So while Sophie was speaking, I have actually been looking at the questions that you've sent in, which are great questions. So I'm going to give Sophie a chance to have a look at those whilst we look at some of the questions that were sent in beforehand. So I'm going to take the top two, and then Sophie's going to take the next three. So there were quite a few questions on intermittent fasting. And I think this is really interesting because I have a view on it in general, but I also have a different view on it since the pandemic. So basically, nutrition is obviously our focus, but more generally, from a neuroscience point of view, we really look at some physical pillars of brain performance, which are sleep, nutrition, hydration, oxygenation, so through exercise and deep breathing and mindfulness. Now, if you are doing really well in all of those categories, then you can consider moving yourself or your patients to what's called time-restricted eating, which is eating within a time window. Like I do 12 noon till 8 p.m. Some people do 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., which is very doable, which means that you're having an overnight fast of 12 to 16 hours. There are significant brain benefits on fasting for 7 hours from the point of waking up till you first eat. And then that's kind of like level 2. Level 3, like the cherry on the icing on the cake, is intermittent fasting, which is basically the 5-2 diet. So on 2 non-consecutive days of the week, you limit your calories to 500 calories for women and 600 calories for men. But since the pandemic, I have not been recommending intermittent fasting to anyone. I actually started it again myself and then realized that the way it works is by stressing your system. And I didn't need any more stress in the last 15 months. So as soon as I realized that, I stopped. Basically, it's a form of stress inoculation. So the 2 days that you essentially starve yourself is stress. And then you build up your mental resilience by always being able to eat normally the next day. And so through that process of causing stress and then demonstrating recovery to your brain, you build up your resilience. And it does have weight loss benefits. But, I've always done it mainly for the brain benefits. However, as I said, with people having such high levels of the stress hormone cortisol, which is driving the storing up of fat in our abdominal fat cells, unfortunately, adding more stress into the system doesn't seem like the right thing to do. Which takes me nicely onto the second question, which is why can't some people lose weight despite eating well and exercising? Sophie may add to this, but from the neuroscience point of view, chronically elevated levels of the stress hormone cortisol are the number one reason for that happening, particularly if the weight is retained around the middle and not visible so much on the arms and legs. So cortisol is a steroid hormone. So like if you prescribe your patient steroids, you know that they can get that figure that's either called lemon on sticks or, sort of like a Humpty Dumpty type shape, where the fat is largely abdominal. And I hear so many executives say, I've started eating less, I've started exercising more, and I cannot shift, that I've had to let the belt out one buckle. And I always then treat them for stress and high levels of cortisol. Back to you, Sophie.
Thanks, Tara. Look, I've got my face back. I think it's to do with the charger anyway. Question number 3 that we had, one of the other ones we picked out was, what does a brain-friendly diet for kids look like? And I think that's a really important question, because I know there'll be lots of people with children and also people working with children. I will say I am not a paediatric dietitian, so I've never worked with kids myself, and we are certainly an adult brain care company. But one of the things that I think is really important to say is that children's brain health needs exactly the same sorts of things as an adult's brain does. And children go through these periods of rapid brain development when, potentially they're more vulnerable to fussy eating, for example, and things like that, which is difficult and can be difficult for parents to manage. But as long as people are still looking towards that kind of mind diet way of eating, ensuring that the children are getting fish and plenty of different coloured vegetables and being offered lots of different variety in terms of plant-based foods and everything else, we can hope that the children will also benefit from all of the things that we've been talking about this evening in terms of brain health and brain optimization. Really important to recognise the importance of those, or the benefit of animal proteins, particularly in those fussy eating periods where it can be so easy to get deficient if children stop eating lentils and pulses and those things that might be essential in a plant-based diet to meet some of those needs. So just thinking that a brain-friendly diet for children looks exactly the same as a brain-friendly diet for adults, just a little bit smaller and in different quantities, but it's pretty much exactly the same thing. And Tara put it really nicely as we were preparing for this meeting by saying that if I had a child, they'd be eating exactly the same diet as me to promote their brain health. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about it. Hydration and the brain is a really important and interesting one. The question around this was about how much fluid people need. And what we need is around 35 mils of fluid per kilogram of body weight, as long as our body weight is within generally the normal range. So that means that for most people, it's between 2 litres and 2.5 litres a day, maybe up to 3 litres if you're a bigger, taller person. But 35 mils per kilo is the general calculation that we use for people under the age of 65 in any case. Over the age of 65, it's 30 mils per kilo. We know that even being just 1% dehydrated can have a really big impact on your mental performance. So that's been played out in studies, and we can see how that impacts focus, concentration, memory, working memory, all these things that we all rely on so much every day. So if you are feeling that you are becoming mentally fatigued, or your patients and clients are complaining of that, then do be thinking importantly about hydration, how that's impacting. Is it right, Ty, that your brain's about 70% water?
Yeah,
so if you're
and that's
not hydrated enough,
it's always confusing, because when I say it's so much fat and so much water, the solid part is mostly fat, but the whole brain is mostly water.
Yeah, so you can see then how even just a small amount of dehydration can have that impact on our brain health and function. Back to you, Tara.
Yeah, so we had various questions about usage of SSRIs, which are a certain family of antidepressants, and whether you're weaning off them, whether you are wondering if, a certain diet can help you to not have to take them. I mean, I would always work with somebody on an individual basis when I was a psychiatrist to make decisions like that. But I'll pretty much say what Sophie said about a brain-friendly diet for kids, which is that if you're requiring an SSRI, or you're about to try to wean off one, or if you're considering, whether you might need one, then eating in the way that we've talked about is exactly what you should be doing to contribute to your own body being able to make enough serotonin and have the receptors be sensitive enough. There's absolutely a time and place for medication, but having a brain-friendly diet can definitely boost the impact, perhaps allowing the dosage to be lower, and help people to sustain not being on antidepressants long term.
Yeah, there's that great data, isn't there, about B vitamin supplementation and SSRI use, and how that can really impact efficacy of the SSRI. So I think, as you say, I mean, I guess I have a question on that. If someone was saying say they came to see me as a dietitian, it said, my doctor said I need SSRIs, but I want to try lifestyle first. How long do you think changing into a mind diet and lifestyle diet, do you think it might take for somebody to see some of those benefits? I know it's really difficult to say, but...
I mean, I think that the patient would really answer the question themselves, because it would take quite a long time. So if their mood was not sufficiently low that they could take the time, and I'm talking, I would say at least 3 months, if they can tolerate feeling depressed for 3 months. And we know that Dan, our co-founder, he, improved his his mood and insomnia through both a better diet and supplementation, then I would happily work with somebody who was trying to do that. But obviously I was seeing people who were severely depressed, sometimes like not even able to eat or drink. So in that case, I wouldn't, I would know that an SSRI could make you feel a lot better in 2 weeks and, even better than that in a month. So I'd probably suggest that. But I think if it's somebody who's moderately depressed, who is aware and able to make the dietary changes, then absolutely work along with them until they say, I don't want to feel like this anymore.
Yeah, good point in terms of how debilitating the mental health problems are.
Yeah.
So we've got a really great question here from Anushka in the audience, Tara, for you. You mentioned about magnesium being reduced during stressful times. Could increasing your magnesium intake reduce the feelings of stress, or are they not linked?
No, they're linked. So I love that question, because basically cortisol and stress are completely like this. Like if your cortisol levels are high, you will be feeling some symptoms of stress, whether it's insomnia, irritability, anxiety, weight gain. And equally, if you're feeling like that, it indicates that your cortisol levels are high. Now, when cortisol is circulating at a high level in the blood that's going throughout the brain and the body, that's basically like Pac-Man eating up your magnesium. So if you are able to massively increase the magnesium, then it does have a sort of seesaw effect with the cortisol. So I find that the way that that's most noticeable is if you have a bath with magnesium salts and you stay in it for at least 15 to 20 minutes, you can actually really feel the impact of that. Also with the magnesium sprays and gels and lotions, when you apply it, if you feel very, very tingly, it means that you're deficient, and that, so basically it's changing the balance of the salts as it's being absorbed. And this is anecdotal, but what I found recently with some friends is that where they applied it made a difference. So I had a friend who has a lot of jaw tension, and when she applied it directly onto the jaw, it was so tingly. So I tried that and it wasn't tingly for me, but there are other, I sort of hold my stress in my shoulders. So I apply it to the bottom of my feet. You can do a foot bath. If it's summer, you can do bath salts in cold water. If it's winter, obviously it's nice to have a hot foot bath or a hot bath. So yeah, if you really keep your magnesium topped up, you will definitely feel the benefits of that.
Nice. And we had a question about sources of B12, which I think I answered. So thinking about those, there aren't any, let's say, naturally occurring sources of B12 on a plant-based diet. So really important to think about using fortified foods. So lots of vegan products will be fortified with vitamin B12, sadly not with other B vitamins. And I think that's something that we are really keen to encourage as a community. And also you can use something called nutritional yeast, which is like a flavoring powder that's got lots of vitamin B12 in it. So spread that across your food. Otherwise it will be a case of supplementation and most people on a vegan diet would benefit from B vitamin supplementation. And the other one, Tara, then that I've got here is about omegas. So is algae oil an acceptable source of omegas, was the question.
Well, that's kind of like, I have to send a check in the post to Rachel, because we actually have algae oil in the double capsule at Heights. So we wanted the capsule to be vegetarian and vegan friendly, just so that we were inclusive. But also, I love the way that Dan puts it, which is if you can't eat the fish for whatever reason, ethical or, other choices, think about what the fish eat. The omega oils actually come from the algae. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah, agreed. And then the other one that I think is a good one to answer is about red wine. So dose of red wine. How much red wine do we need to get the right amount of resveratrol to have the impact on our health? And how much is too much? Tara, one for you.
Well, I think you might disagree with me on this, so I'm going to answer it and see what you say. Basically, I just want to say as a disclaimer that I am not teetotal, so I do drink alcohol, but I think that saying that you should drink this much red wine is misleading, because you can get that resveratrol from drinking red grape juice. So if you don't drink, then you should not start drinking to try to get resveratrol. If you drink anyway, then red wine is a better choice than other forms of alcohol. Obviously, the government guidelines for both men and women are that you should not exceed 14 units per week. I think for the actual number of what's enough, I'll have to defer to you, Sophie.
So I think that the guidance is 1 glass of red wine in the evening with a meal. But I completely agree with you, Tara. No one should be thinking they need to start drinking wine or anything else in order to benefit their health. It can come from other places. It's just that that's one of the most common food sources of that particular polyphenol. And so ultimately we can get it from elsewhere. Undoubtedly, the negative side of drinking outweighs the positives, particularly as soon as we tip into too much, which is very easy to do with alcohol, especially during a pandemic. So just being conscious of that and being aware of that is a severely limiting factor of all of the benefits of the things you might be doing with your diet. If you're binge drinking or drinking too much in any way, then that will undoubtedly undo the benefits of all the other health things that you're trying to do.
Actually, Sophie, that kind of leads me back to question 2, which is why can't some people lose weight just by eating well and exercising? The stress is, the sort of biggest neurological factor. But alcohol is another reason. And also when people say I eat well, I always get them to do a 1-week food and drink diary, because the idea of what eating well is varies quite significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. It varies massively depending on your family upbringing. Lots of people will think, well, I eat better than my parents, so I eat well. And actually your parents might have eaten terribly, and that's not necessarily the biggest step in the right direction.
Yeah.
In the interest of time then, I'm going to suggest, so we've had one really nice question from Kristen, which is some examples of the holy grail meals that include ingredients that fulfill both brain health and gut health. And I will start with my favorite, which is smoked mackerel pate, which I make with equal parts of smoked mackerel pate and low-fat cream cheese, some horseradish. I might put some cayenne pepper in there, maybe some turmeric, some of those sort of spices that also have those gut health benefits and some polyphenols. And then I'm going to serve that with loads of chopped up raw vegetables. So amazing for your gut health, really filling and satisfying, and some really nice whole grain breads to go with that as well. So a couple of really delicious seeded crackers and that sort of thing as well. It's my favorite. Whenever I have that, I think, yeah, my brain's really enjoying this and my gut's really enjoying this too.
Sophie, we've never ever disagreed before, but I'm gonna have to say something.
What?
Which is that I haven't eaten any smoked food since I was 30. Smoked food is pro-oxidant. So I actually have found a place near my house in London that sells salmon carpaccio.
Nice.
Which tastes almost like smoked salmon. My husband says he can tell the difference. But so I would say I would love that meal if the mackerel wasn't smoked. And I'm going to say my favorite meal like that would be a piece of salmon or rainbow trout, if you're trying to be more sustainable, with all dark purple vegetables, so purple sprouting broccoli, maybe some black beans, and some kimchi or sauerkraut on the side. Yeah, that would be my favorite. But basically, I think including a fermented product almost on a daily basis, even though I take a probiotic every morning. Fish. Well, another nice one, another good breakfast is scrambled eggs with the salmon carpaccio and maybe some pumpkin seeds and some spinach. So we didn't really talk enough about nuts and seeds. I really continually have to remind myself how critical they are to our brain function. So everything that you said with seeds on top.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's another really important thing. It's not just for our gut health, but also for all those nutrients that they're so key for. And people aren't necessarily very good at eating nuts, but they're just the perfect snack between meals for everything, for regulating blood glucose and everything else. One last question, I think, is how can you get enough quality amino acids on a vegan or plant on a vegan diet? And I'll take that one if that's all right, Tara. Yeah. It's more difficult, but you definitely can do it. And it's about matching your protein sources and having a really good variety of plant-based protein sources. So one of the mistakes I think that people on a vegan diet can make is to rely heavily on, let's say, processed soya products or processed corn products, for example, or just having pulses and not having corn and soya and some of those other protein sources that you can include in your diet, and tofu, etc. So it really is about variety of protein sources. And the reason for that is because plant-based protein sources are rarely complete protein sources. What we mean by that is they don't contain all of the essential amino acids. So we have to kind of marry them up with other protein sources or things like grains in order to achieve complete proteins and not miss out on any of those essential amino acids, which are so important for your brain function. We were talking about choline before the presentation and lots of other important things, but ultimately it is about mixing and matching your protein sources on vegan diets, never getting caught in a rut of having the same proteins on repeat. Really think about limiting those processed vegan products, because they can, and in the same way as any other processed foods, have a detrimental impact on our health. So think about focusing on variety of protein sources and matching them up with grains, and also so grains plus a protein source generally helps you to achieve a complete protein when you're on a vegan diet. And that means that you'll be getting everything that you need from an amino acid perspective. Anything you want to add to that, Tara?
No, not to that. That was a perfect answer. I was just thinking, Adam, could we just go back to the ambassador program slide? Because I'd really like to hear about that again from you, actually.
From me. So what we would like to do is have a team of ambassadors who can help us to spread the word about brain health. So if you are somebody who is interested in brain health, something who is excited by the possibility of working with Heights and learning more about what we do, then we would really encourage people to get in touch. I think there's a link in the chat box. It's something to do where we're trying to sort of create this team of brain care ambassadors who can also have a bit of an inside information on our product development, on our research, and opportunities to work with me and Tara and the team a bit more, as well as getting some exposure across our platforms, our socials and our blog and our newsletter, etc. So there should be a link in the chat box that you can read, that you can follow to learn more if that is something you're interested in. But yeah, happy to answer questions on that at a later date if people did want to find out more. I think, Tara, we should leave people to their evenings. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for giving up one of the few evenings that has actually decent weather. So we really hope, I mean, we've loved talking to you, and we'd love to interact with you more. So just to say, we hope that you enjoyed this and that it added something to your practice possibly, and that within a week or two, we will be sending out a written sort of fact sheet or article if you'd like.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. And also we're looking to do more of these events, so there will be a feedback form afterwards where we'll ask you about what you would like us to cover and what you're interested in. So we would love to hear your thoughts and get some feedback from you all, because we're here to provide a service to you so that you can continue to learn and understand more about brain health and why it's so important. So whatever we can do to serve you in that department, we would be very happy to. Thank you very much. And I think that will be goodbye.
Thanks so much, Sophie. You're amazing.